Ken, thank you for that introduction. As you were expressing all those nice things about me, I was thinking the same thing, so that's great. And what a wonderful opportunity to be here. I'm truly honored to be at Gettysburg College this evening. I had a great time driving from Washington today with the trees in full flower in terms of color. It was just a joyous trip, and obviously the seasons are changing. It's getting a little chillier. We know it gets cold in Washington when the politicians start to walk around with their hands in their own pockets. Then we know it's really cold. We're starting to see that now. And it's been fun to be around campus today. I met with some students, had a chance to be at the reception before dinner, talk with some folks. You know, it's so interesting because until recently with my firing from NPR, I was working at both Fox and NPR. You know, some people would come up to me and say, hey, you know, you're the guy on Fox, it's good to meet you. And then others, especially in the college community, would say, oh, you know, I listen to you on NPR. And it's finally nice to put a face with the voice. To which I would think, well, gosh, they never watch TV. And then secondly, I would think, I didn't know what you look like either. It's a surprise to me. But on all those levels, you're a good-looking crowd, and it's nice to be with you tonight. Before I begin, I just wanted to reiterate what an honor it is to have the opportunity to speak with you tonight. It's particularly honored and grateful to the Blavatt family. A special debt to Susan, the family matriarch who recently died. With her husband, Ron, Susan founded this lecture series now 13 years old. And Ron and their sons, Jason and Jeffrey, who directs the Eisenhower Institute, are here tonight with their dad. And I just wanted to acknowledge them and say that your family's love of education and Gettysburg College is a gift that crosses generations and time. And from the bottom of my heart, and I think speaking for this community, we want to express our appreciation to you. Thank you very much. Janet Morgan Riggs, the president of the college, Chris Zapper, the provost, I want to thank you for joining us for this Blavatt lecture tonight. Part of the glory of this lecture series is that it invites a range of ideas and political agendas to campus in the great tradition of free speech. A great liberal arts education is celebrated here at Gettysburg College. And at a time of economic anxiety, I think it's too often the case that young people and sometimes their parents view college simply as a credential necessary for a first job or entry into a graduate school. Gettysburg's insistence on the value of critical thinking about a variety of subjects, its insistence that so many young people make an effort to travel abroad, to learn another language, to experience life, experience-based learning, and to have political awareness. I think these are the pillars of the highest standard of liberal arts education. One of those is the freedom, one of those pillars is the freedom to speak, to criticize, to challenge each other, not only each other, but the right to challenge the government, the university itself, the church, the media. This to me is the heart of democracy, heart of America. No change is possible without a freedom to have full-throated discourse and exchange of ideas. No change is possible, no growth from the Civil War to civil rights without this full-throated exchange of ideas and challenge to ideas, challenge to orthodoxies. So allow me a personal moment here. I've been through a storm in the last few weeks. This is the first time I've spoken about it in public. And I'm not just talking about my recent visit to the White House after the election. This is a different storm I'm talking about. My storm began when I told Bill O'Reilly on TV that there was no way to get around the fact of there being a worldwide problem with radical Islam. And I said candidly that when I get on an airplane and I see people who are dressed in Islamic garb, identifying themselves to me first and foremost as Muslims, it makes me nervous. Now, the context for this is that Mr. O'Reilly had been on another television program, The View, and he had expressed the idea that the U.S. had been attacked by Muslims on 9/11, to which two of the co-hosts walked off the set until he apologized and said that he should have said extremists or radical Muslims. So then he brought this up on his show with me for further discussion. And I candidly said to him that I had this anxiety about seeing Muslims in an airport, especially after 9/11, after what had happened in London, Madrid, Indonesia, the shoe bomber, after the recent Christmas attempt in Times Square, and of course after the man who had attempted the Times Square bombing had said this was just the beginning of a war with Muslims. Now, I added to Bill that we can't jump from fear to violating the rights of American Muslims. I, in fact, suggested that he think about how people might view Christians, given Timothy McVeigh, or the Olympic bomber in Atlanta, or the people with the Westboro, I should say, Baptist Church, who picket military funerals while shouting that God hates gays. I said we cannot violate the rights of people of any faith, especially their constitutional rights, based on the actions of extremists. We never want America to be a place where good people of any faith, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Christians, are attacked because of fears and rhetoric about their religion. Now, that discussion, which I can assure you was heartfelt and honest, led my employer of 10 years, NPR, to fire me. So tonight I just wanted to say that in this environment where the liberal arts and the whole notion of free speech and critical thinking is embraced, that I am puzzled as to how we as Americans can solve problems of racial, ethnic, and religious discrimination and difference if we are unable to have a straightforward and open dialogue about feelings. You know, for me, I wasn't just fired, but subjected to public ridicule as needing a psychiatrist or a publicist to determine what I should say. And by the way, I can assure you I don't have either. But it just suggested that my comments were somehow not to be tolerated in decent company and to be punished by forcing me out of a job that I loved and had done for more than 10 years. I think it has been rewarding to me to see the incredible support from people on the left and the right who have expressed their concerns about this kind of activity. But it's been a chilling experience for me, and I fear that it might be chilling for other people in the media who too want to have honest and direct dialogue, and I fear even more so that for the young people in this audience, young people who are engaged, I hope, in critical thinking and vigorous debate in the classroom, that you will not be chilled or scared off or intimidated by people who want to silence you or tell you to shut up, that nobody wants to hear your opinion, no matter how unpopular it might be. I saw a quote the other day, and it, to me, really spoke to it. It was George Washington, one of our founding fathers, speaking to the troops, to his officers back in the 1700s, and he was talking about why he was engaged in this revolution. And he said, "For if men are to be precluded from offering their sentiments on any matter which may involve the most serious and alarming consequences, then reason is no use to us." And I think to myself that George Washington's words ring true even to this day, that if we are to be a people of reason, we have to be a people who are free to express our thoughts and then, of course, bear the consequences for having done so. But I would hope that we would not have to face down those who would tell us to just simply shut up. Now, the reason that I mention all of this is not simply that it has just obviously changed my life, but because the invitation for me to speak to all of you tonight was really to talk to you about the state of American politics. And in that regard, this tension about speaking out, about expressing grievance, could not be more central than at this moment. Last week, after the election, as I was poring over the exit poll data, it was striking to me to see that 75% of Americans said that they were either angry, 25% angry, or 50% discontented and dissatisfied with American government. These are people speaking to their elected leaders, to their political leaders, about their attitudes towards the government. These are people expressing discontent and, as I said, anger. And if you are a political strategist, you know that over the last 3 cycles we've been through, 2006, when the House and the Senate changed hands from Republican to Democrat, 2008, when we had a first-term, most liberal senator from Illinois and an African-American elected president, to this cycle in 2010, when we've seen the House shift back to Republican control, that the electorate has been whipsawing, trying to find someone who will capture their discontent, their anger, and who will change government to better reflect and meet the needs of the American people. You know, I'm amazed at how much change we've been through over the course of the last 10 years or so. It's been one tumultuous ride. You stop and think about it for a second. We've impeached an American president, Bill Clinton. You come forward from that and the polarizing effect that had on the American electorate to the year 2000, when we had another polarizing election in 2000, the election that was decided not on election day or even election night, but decided by the Supreme Court several weeks later. And then you go forward from there and you come to the events of 9/11 that absolutely traumatized the country, but did bring us together. You remember all the American flags everywhere. But we went back to the idea of being polarized yet again when there were no weapons of mass destruction. And then by 2004 came the swift voting of John Kerry and the Democratic presidential candidate, the charges that President Bush lied and blood for oil, that he was after Saddam because of his father. You remember all of this. And then we go forward again to 2006, and as I mentioned earlier, the shift from Republican to Democrats in the House and the Senate, and then Barack Obama in 2008, and now we see the shift back again in terms of the House. So this has been a roller coaster ride in terms of American politics, and for the students in the room, this has been American politics up close for most of their lifetime. It has been so unpredictable, it's been a little bit of a horror show. And the idea of government truly representing people and truly satisfying need and protecting people, all of this has been called into question in the course of the last 10 years. And that's why, beginning in the midst of this decade, political strategists have been plugged into one incredible number. It's called right track, wrong track. You ask people, is the country headed in the right direction or the wrong direction? In 2008, 80% of the American people said the country's headed in the wrong direction. 80%. Now that's incredible. If you're in the polling business, you would think to yourself, my gosh, we must be in some war-torn land. How is that possible? And of course, you would think the economy was in total collapse. You would think that the government was dysfunctional. Typically, that's what you'd have to have in order to have 80% of any people saying to you the country's headed in the wrong direction. Today, it's about 60% of the American people who say the country's headed in the wrong direction. Now, when I was offering you that, that panorama of all the political changes that have been taking place in the country, I didn't even mention to you that we had gone to war, first in Afghanistan and then Iraq. I didn't mention to you the economic instability that has been so present and that took us to the verge of depression and has left us struggling to simply climb out of a very deep recession. And the attendant spending in terms of stimulus packages, TARP, that has driven up the size of the US deficit. I didn't mention all of those issues. But for people who say to the pollsters that the country's headed in the wrong direction, they point directly at the idea that the country's been involved in wars that are unpopular, wars that cost a lot of money, and sadly have cost a lot of lives. And they mention the tremendous anxiety that attaches to living through these economic times when people not only worry about getting a job, they worry about whether or not their children can get a job, they worry about holding on to their jobs, they worry about their pensions, about retirement. They feel as if their children will not lead lives that are as rich in opportunity and economic growth as the lives that they have led themselves. And that's why they tell the pollsters they feel the country's headed in the wrong direction. Now, when you stop and think about all of these elements, these factors that are creating anxiety, anger, and discontent on the part of the American electorate, you come quickly to understand that there's a lot going on here. There are questions that you want to raise as critical thinkers with people about, well, why are you so discontented? Why are you so angry? And the answer comes back pretty clearly from a surprising source. As you know, this year, 2010, is a year in which the U.S. Census is counting all of us, the American people. But it was just over a year ago that the census came out and said, you know what? We estimate now that the country is a country of more than 300 million people. America's never been such a populous country. 300 million. I remember when I first saw this being stunned by it, I couldn't believe it. 300 million people. And I remember thinking to myself, I wonder how this country has grown in population to such an extent, especially when you understand that the census estimates that we will soon be a country, within the next 10 to 15 years, a country of about 400 million people. And you think to yourself, wow, it's not only that we have grown to such a size, but that the rate of growth continues to spiral upward. How is it possible? And I remember thinking to myself, it just doesn't make sense, because if you look at the largest sector of the American population, white America, the birth rate is declining. Fewer and fewer people. So then you think to yourself, well, maybe it's the minorities, it's the blacks and the Hispanics, but when you look at the growth rate, birth rate of black Americans, you see that it's flat to declining. And if you look at the birth rate of Hispanic Americans, you see it's increasing, but slightly, and nowhere near the magnitude necessary to justify such an increase in the population. But then you start to look at things like immigration. And you start to understand that this country is undergoing a wave of immigration, the likes of which we've never seen before. You might say it's comparable to what happened at the start of the century, when about 15% of the country was made up of immigrants. But remember, as I've just described to you, we're a much bigger country in terms of population than we've ever been to. So when we say that about 15% of the population is made up of immigrants, well, it's a much larger absolute number, because it's a much larger population that we're talking about. And it's not only that we see a surge of immigrants that makes for the so-called hyphenated Americans and Americans who speak so many different languages, and the fact that if you turn on the TV and the radio in markets from New York to Los Angeles to Houston and LA, that all of a sudden you can find stations, the number one station in these markets being Spanish speaking, speaking different languages. It's just incredible. But it's also longevity, people living longer, that's adding to the population. All of this combining for this tremendous growth, this tremendous dynamism, this tremendous change that's taking place in America today. And I got to tell you, and especially I want to drive this point home to the students tonight, I was stunned to realize that the census reported that a quarter of the American population today, a quarter of that population is made up of people who are under the age of 18. People under the age of 18 are the largest single cohort in the American demographic today. Now, I'm 56. I had no idea that there were that many young people in the United States. I had no idea. We always talk about the aging of America and all, but you know what? The biggest single group of Americans are those who are 18 and younger. I remember saying to my friends, to my fellow journalists, did you know that a quarter of the population is made up of people who are under 18? I remember some of them saying to me, man, have you gone to the movies lately? There's a lot of vampires in those movies, and they're not made for people your age, you know? Or I remember my wife saying to me, have you gone to the mall lately to go shopping? With the recession, even with the recession, the stores that are doing well tend to be Old Navy and Gap, Abercrombie and Fitch and Hollister. They're selling to people under the age of 18. Those are the people who are buying. That's what the market reflects right now. And I remember thinking to myself, this is amazing. So many young people. My wife said to me, you should go into one of those stores and buy a pair of jeans. I said, why? She said, well, they won't fit your butt, I'll tell you that, you know. So I came to understand, my gosh, you know, there are lots of young people in this country. The country's changing. And I thought to myself, well, you know, I really need to understand what's going on with young people in this country as a journalist. Because I certainly saw lots of young people, including those under 18, during the 2008 campaign, especially when it came to President, then candidate, I should say, Obama. He was, as you know, and as critics have often said, a rock star that attracted lots of young people who were just thrilled with his candidacy and surrounded him with the kind of adulation that you would attach to a rock star. But I really didn't know what it was like to be under 18 in America today. So what I did as a journalist was I went to visit a high school. And I picked a high school in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Washburn High. And I went in and I tried to arrange meetings, interviews with groups of students. But I got to tell you, what happened was pretty useless for me, because I would say to them, how come you're all walking around in these big T-shirts, you know, big sweatshirts, Timberland boots that are unlaced, baseball caps turned to the side and backwards? You know, how come you're all drinking Starbucks coffee and Red Bull and Mountain Dew, all these highly caffeinated, sugary drinks? And the kids would inevitably say to me, man, you don't know me. I'm the biggest individual. You don't know anything about me. And I got to tell you, they all look like automatons to me. They all look like Jennifer Aniston, you know, straight here, walking to her. But it's useless. They have no use for me. They think that, you know, I just don't get what it's like to be a young person today. Well, then I ran into a woman who had been a student at this Washburn High when she was a high school age in the 1960s. She had since sent her children there in the late 80s and 90s and was now working as a counselor at the high school. So I said to her, what's the big difference between Washburn High in the 1960s and Washburn High today? To which she said, Juan, it should be obvious to you, you asked to meet with our very best students, the ones who are getting the highest SAT scores and going off to the best colleges and universities. You asked to meet with the student leaders, the ones who run student government, the people who are involved in getting internships and doing volunteer work in the community, the ones who run student government. You asked to meet with the very best athletes, the ones who are getting scholarships to play sports at Division I schools. What did you notice? And I said, well, what do you mean? They're nice people. What are you talking about? And she said, well, wait a minute. How could you not notice that 8 out of 10 of the very best students in this school are young women? And I said, wow, you know, you're right. And then she said, wait a minute, how could you not have noticed that 7 out of the 10 student leaders we brought to meet with you were young women? And at that point, I'm like, wow. And then she says, and how is it possible that you didn't notice that when you met with the very best athletes here, that 5 out of 10 of them after Title IX were young women? And I've got to tell you guys, for me, it was like someone opened a window. You know, it was like you're out in the rain and you just want to run out of the rain. You don't understand that something bigger than a simple storm is happening, that it might be flood and that it might be changing the landscape. You don't have time to stand around and look and appreciate the raindrops. You're just getting out of it. And it just struck me in that moment, oh my gosh, for this generation, the role of women, the prominence of women, the success of women is a signal event. It is changing what it's like to live in America. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, wait a minute, in my world in Washington right now, a third of the U.S. Congress is made up of women. You stop and look at the U.S. Senate. I think it's now 16 or 17 members of the U.S. Senate are women. You think about something like the State Department, where we've gone from Condoleezza Rice to Hillary Clinton, to the face of America to the world in terms of our top diplomat being a woman. Or in my business, in the media, where you now have 2 of the 3 major network broadcasts led by women, Diane Sawyer and Katie Couric. Or you think about the Supreme Court, where we now have a record number of women sitting on the court and the potential for even more to come. And if you talk to people at colleges and universities, college presidents, university presidents often tell me these days that when they practice affirmative action, it's most often practiced for young men. Because they said if they simply went on test scores and recommendations and writing samples, the schools would be all women. Sometimes say to them, well, why aren't they all women? Why do you have to, let boys in at a higher rate than they should be? And they have a simple answer I find rather amusing. They say, girls like boys. But if you go on to the graduate and professional school level, it becomes even more pronounced. It's obvious. I think at Gettysburg you have a higher percentage of women than men in the student body. But once you get to graduate and professional school, with the exception of engineering and physics, women are the majority of the students. The majority. So think about what that means going forward. And the Census Bureau has already reported within the last year that women are now the majority of the workforce. It's truly an incredible change. And when it comes to politics, without a doubt, women are the swing vote in American political life. Anytime you're watching a political ad on TV in the middle of a campaign season, just for a second, imagine that you are a white suburban woman, because then you'll understand who the politicians are speaking to. They're not speaking to the far right or the far left. They're speaking to women who are paying attention at the last moment, women who have been described as everything from soccer moms to security moms after 9/11 to now mortgage moms. They're people who make a decision in the final days before a campaign. They're highly likely to vote, and they care. All the ads are speaking to that population. So I mention this to you because it's such a shift, and it's having impact on the way we live as Americans. You stop and think about the rate, for example, of out-of-wedlock births in the country right now, which is skyrocketing. It's about a third of the white children born in the country are born to single moms these days. It's about half of the Hispanic children who are born to single mothers. And as a black man, I tell you with some sadness that it's 70% of the black children in the country are born to single parents these days. What I'm talking about there is women making a decision in many cases that they don't need a husband, or that they want to have a baby, but they don't want necessarily all the weight that comes from men who are not performing, who might not have a job, who are not as well educated. Going back to that high school experience that I was describing for you earlier, if you look at the dropout rates, and especially in the minority community, it is just tragic, absolutely tragic, to see the rate at which minority boys are dropping out of school in a time of economic stress and a time of global economic competition. It is an absolute prescription for failure. And it has impact then down the road because we have children being born to single moms, resulting in higher levels of poverty, again, disproportionately in the minority community. But it's true across the board in all segments of American life, because a single mom simply doesn't have the economic wherewithal that two parents can offer. And then, of course, it extends into the classroom, because a child born to a single mom doesn't have anybody to walk him or her to the library, to read to them at night, to encourage their imagination, to get them ready to learn on the first day of kindergarten. And then we talk about achievement gaps and racial differences, but oftentimes we don't talk about this very central breakdown in terms of family life in America that's going on, and the increased responsibilities and the increased earning power and the increased roles that women are playing in so many facets of our world today. Now, I mention all this to you because, again, it is shifting the way that we view reality and all of the economic and political turmoil that's impacting our country and driving people to feel a lack of faith and trust in our most important institutions. If you ask people, the American people today, about leadership in the country, they could not be more dismissive. And this extends from Wall Street to the White House to the church. people do not trust leadership in America today. They do not feel that our leadership is being true to the American people. And this, of course, results in lots of mocking of leadership, anger towards leadership, a sense of betrayal. And that's what we're seeing in this whipsawing in terms of the vote, that people are constantly looking for somebody who's actually going to deliver for them and hold to the promise that they truly are a voice for the American people. Now, one more thing. The census also reports that we're living longer than ever. Next year, 2011, is the first year in which the baby boomers turn age 65. And after that, well, it's just like Niagara Falls, so many people going over, if you get the idea. And by the year 2025 or so, a quarter of the American population will be over the age of 65. So imagine a barbell, weight on one end and weight on the other end. On one end, you have this huge population under the age of 18. On the other end, this huge population about to turn age 65 or older. That is what the American population looks like right now to a demographer. That's what we look like. And I thought to myself, much as I had been concerned about not understanding what it's like to be under 18 today, I thought to myself, I should go and visit with people who are over 65 to see what their lives are like today. So right away, I got on a plane for Florida. I don't think that's going to be any surprise to any of you. And I went right to the heart of Florida. I went to Orlando, and I went to a senior citizen center. And as I'm driving up with people who have TV cameras and sound equipment and producers, there's this loud, raucous, heavy metal music playing. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, this is terrible. This must be keeping these old people up. This is just terrible, awful noise. So I get out of the car, and here comes the woman from the Senior Citizen Center to greet me, to say hello. And she says, oh, don't worry about the noise. It's great music. We all enjoy it so. And I'm thinking, no, you don't understand. I can't do my interviews with this kind of thing playing. And besides, I said, this is just terrible music. And she says, what? Come with me. And she leads me into the courtyard of the Senior Citizen Center, where there are 5 people who look to be well over 75, just rocking out, just having a great time. And I was thinking to myself, wow, people that age playing heavy metal music, you can tell by looking at me, I'm not a heavy metal type of guy. So I'm like, wow, what's going on here? And this is 3 years ago now. She says to me, Juan, do you realize what the top grossing summer tour, rock and roll tour was this year? And I said, no, I had no idea. She said, well, it was someone over 65. I said, come on, who could that be? And she said, Tina Turner. And I said, great legs, that's unbelievable. Over 65, really? But again, it's one of those moments where someone opens a window in your world, because I remember later thinking, even this year at the Super Bowl, the halftime entertainment this year I think was The Who, right? And I remember thinking, man, those guys are old. That's really something. And they're in their mid-60s, The Who. And then last year they had Bruce Springsteen. Man, he was doing splits across the stage. I was thinking, that old guy's going to hurt himself. He better watch out, right? He's in his 60s. Or you think about Ringo Starr being in his 70s. Or you think about people like Prince and Tom Petty being in their late 50s, and you start to think, wow, this is your rock and roll generation. This is unbelievable. I remember looking at, list of top-selling albums in the country. You can tell by the fact I even say albums how old I am, right? Okay, so top-selling music in the country, however people download it or get it. And the top-selling music in the country are people like, the Rolling Stones, the Eagles, right? These are old people. And then you get, what's really incredible to me is Bob Dylan, I think last year had the top-selling music album, whatever you want to call it, in the country. And I don't know if you've seen Bob Dylan's face recently, but he's an old man, So I'm thinking, wow. So these people are making music. And I go inside the Senior Citizen Center, and there are all these travel agents. And the travel agents say to me that after 9/11, if it wasn't for the seniors, that the cruise ship industry, the airline industry, the railroads, they would have just gone out of business. But that seniors love to travel. And then there are people there from colleges and universities for extended learning. And they say to me, oh gosh, the seniors love to come on campus. They love the classrooms. They love the sports. They love the lectures. They just love the whole atmosphere. In fact, they're now building on campus some dorms and housing specifically for seniors so they can live on campus. I'm like, wow. In fact, one guy, one smart ass said to me, he said, you know what? The seniors are our best students. They actually read the books. So you never know. And then there were people there who were stockbrokers. And the stockbrokers are saying, oh, this is not, the old generation of the early 20th century. No, these people have money. They're investors. In some cases, these are people who are pooling their incomes, and they're becoming entrepreneurs. They remain as advisors to big companies. Even as companies were downsizing, they would keep some of the older folks, the seniors, as wise men. I'm like, wow, this is unbelievable. And when I would speak to the seniors about their political attitudes and beliefs, I think you could imagine their concerns. Their number one concern was the high cost of prescription drugs. Number two was the viability of Social Security. And number three was access to first-class medical facilities. And I thought to myself, wow, these people are highly involved in politics. They contribute to political campaigns. They volunteer for political campaigns. They watch the news. They listen to the news. They read newspapers. Incredibly active. And I think to myself, after President Bush was reelected in 2004, he said he now had political capital and he was going to use it on one thing, and it was Social Security reform. He didn't get it done, but that was his goal. And that was part of an effort to speak to this population. And I think to myself that before the Obama health care reform effort, the one thing this Congress had done in recent years was to pass a prescription drug benefit, again, speaking to this very same population. And then I think about the Obama health care plan, which initially was intended to meet the concerns of this specific age group about health care, but which caused such concern among that age group that they are now the biggest single point of opposition to Obama's health care plan in the entire country. People who fear that their Medicare, especially Medicare Advantage, may be cut, that their premiums may rise as a result of this health care plan. All of this really based in this one group. And of course, if you go out and you visit a Tea Party rally, what you're essentially seeing are the seniors in revolt, people who are upset, not only over health care, but again, over the possibility of economics diminishing the value of their pensions, upset at what they see as the potential for increase in their taxes. This is what's going on in the country today. I remember wanting to finish out this part of my trip by talking to people in the Orlando community about what it's like to live with so many seniors. And I went to visit the mayor, the people in the congressional offices, and the people at Disney, the biggest employer in the area. And the people at Disney said, oh, we love having the seniors around. But the minute I disconnected my microphone and turned off the lights, they'd say, oh, I should have told you. When we want to expand, the biggest source of opposition comes from the seniors. The way they feel is like, the minute they move to Florida, the door should have closed right behind them. They don't want anybody else coming in here. And if you talk to people in the congressional office, they say, when we're trying to build light rail here, the biggest source of opposition comes from the seniors. They don't think it's going to make any difference. They think it's just going to attract more people here, and they're opposed to enterprise zones and more economic activity. They don't want it. And when I talk to people in the mayor's office, again, once the microphone's off, once the lights are down, they say, we love the seniors, but when it comes to public schools, most of the seniors are white, and most of the kids Well, the kids are a lot of them Hispanics, a lot of them immigrants, some blacks. And the seniors just don't relate to them. They think these kids are kind of thuggish and rude, and they don't speak English, and they're the kids who are at the gas station who don't understand when they simply want to get some gas. So they don't relate well to public schools, and we have a very low level of support for public education right now. And I got to tell you, I think to myself, when I'm hearing all this, I think, it would be so easy in America to write this simply as, well, you have a graying of Central Florida, and you have a browning of Central Florida, and now you're having racial conflict. But in some ways, I think that it's more true to say, you know what, we've got generational conflict going on here. We've got a younger generation with its own agenda in terms of need for education, economic opportunity, versus people who are seniors in America who have their own agenda in terms of trying to protect what they have so that they can have a secure retirement and end of life. And these people have conflict that's playing out in terms of the political arena, and you can see it in so many ways at the very top. Think of John McCain in his 70s running against Barack Obama in his 40s, and think about their base in terms of the American electorate, and how those two, especially if you subtract the economic crisis of late '08, how those two would have played out. So I mention all this to you because I think it's just so important for all of you as thinking, caring people, especially those of you who are students who are trying to understand the world around you apart from all the headlines, all the shouting on TV, all the name calling and finger pointing, all the political polarization, to have a sense of why there is such a high level of discontent and anger in the American electorate today. To understand why it is that between 60 and 80% of the American people would say to pollsters that the country's headed in the wrong direction. To understand why, for some people, you're not supposed to say what's on your mind because it could be too dangerous, it could be combustible. And I'm not just talking about the idea of terrorism, I'm talking about people who fear that if people start to express their ideas, their feelings, their sentiments, that America may be too much of a democracy. Well, I don't think you can have too much democracy, and I would never, ever buy into people who would tell you not to think critically, not to speak your mind, not to vote your mind, not to argue, not to debate. I think that would be the end of our country. I think that would be truly the death knell for who we are as Americans. We have to understand, think, and see each other clearly, transparently. We have to be the kind of people who don't simply watch TV and hear others argue, but the kind of people who would stick our hands into the muck and mire of American life, take risk, reach across political lines and boundaries, speak to people we don't know, come to understand them, appreciate them, have a sense of their point of view, be willing to compromise and understand without sacrificing principle. That's who we are. And that's, in fact, what some people can't tolerate. But I would ask all of you to be the kind of people who would be willing to take a risk, to learn a language, to travel, to think critically, to debate, and to debate without questioning your opponent's integrity or fairness. To be the kind of people that we need as leaders, leaders who can be trusted by any electorate in American life. The kind of people who keep their eyes on the prize. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. I can't wait to get old. We really appreciate your very astute political observations. We appreciate and value your challenge to all of us, I think, to think critically about the events and dynamics which make up our national community. And perhaps most of all, we appreciate your real personal candor. And we thank you very much. Now, the floor is open for questions. We have microphones here. If you don't wish to use the microphones, please speak very loudly so we can all hear. It's your turn, folks.
Hi, my name is Brett Howley. I'm a senior here at Gettysburg College. And I feel like since essentially September 11th, we have learned to grow up in this state of fear, like you were just talking about. You know, be afraid of what's going on in the economy, be afraid of what's going on in the Middle East, be afraid of China's growing, power, be afraid of immigrants coming into our country, all this. So essentially, I'm 21 now. I've been living supposedly in fear for a decade. And I find that to be a long time. And so I was just wondering if you think this fear is justified, or you think it's a tool that politicians use in order to get elected, and if it is justified, is there hope that maybe the fear someday will disappear or will just keep growing?
Well, there are real things to fear in life. There's no question about it. I'm reminded, I think it's something that Louis Armstrong said, which is, if you're not afraid, you're not alive. I mean, there's so much out there that will challenge you and that will absolutely knock your socks off if you stop and think about it for a second. But it's no reason to stop living. Now, the fact is that politicians exploit fears quite constantly in order to stir you to one side or another. I mean, the key to winning election is winning 50.1% of the vote. So if you can inspire fear, or if you can demonize somebody else and make them the source of fears and anxiety for your 50.1%, it's a winning ticket. And you can see it in so many of the negative ads that are so successful and run so constantly in the midst of any campaign season. So it's both true that there are things that are to be feared and that politicians exploit those fears for their own ends. I was touched by what you said about half your life being led under these conditions of political volatility, of fear-mongering in some cases, conspiracy theories that are all about, on the left and on the right, about fixing elections. Remember in 2000, to the kind of rhetoric that attaches now to the buy gold, the economy's about to go into the tank, and all the rest. It's very real that these things are being exploited not only by the politicians but by the advertisers and by the media. So when you, in all honesty, ask me, are there things that are to be feared? Yes. I mean, our country really has challenges. There really are people who are trying to kill us. There really are terrorists. Yes, our economy really is, at times, I think, especially going back towards 08, early 09, our economy was on the verge of a depression. If you stop and think about some of the worldwide threats, including the tremendous power that China is beginning to exercise with regard to currency, it really is going to make for a different future in terms of the American economy and its standing as the world's preeminent economy. That's a huge change coming. The idea that we live in a global economy, that if you are a blue-collar person in America today, it's no longer the case that if you're hardworking and have good values and a strong back that you can support your family. That's not going to be a certainty. There is a structural change taking place in the American economy. And as a student here at Gettysburg, you know what it costs to get a fine education. It's going to be tougher to pay for that education going into the future. It's tough enough for you and your parents. So these are real points of concern. There's a shrinking middle class in the country today. All of this is true. But I think it's also true that horizons are expanding, that we do live in a global society, that as you travel as you encounter new places, you encounter new markets. There are going to be new opportunities. The economy that is seeing a reduction in terms of blue-collar work is seeing an expansion in terms of what people refer to as sort of innovation, innovation economics. Think about growth sectors in the American economy. They tend to be things like healthcare. They tend to be in areas like the service industries, travel, pharmaceuticals. If you watch TV, you see all these ads for new drugs. That they have drugs that will put hair on your head. They have drugs that will reduce your cholesterol. And if this wasn't such a decent audience, I'd tell you what they have drugs that will do. But I'm sure if you watch the commercials, I'll put it to you this way. If this speech should last longer than 4.5 hours, you should seek immediate medical attention. But they've got all kinds of new things on the market, right? So you can choose to live your life worrying about, oh my gosh, the sky is falling. Or you can tap in to the new energy that attaches to innovation and that attaches to the power of global markets and global opportunities. That's the new frontier. In the old days, they used to say, go west, young man or young woman. Today, go visit China. Go visit New Zealand and Australia. See the world. Understand that Brazil is now a world power. Who knew, right? But that's your new world. It's no reason to pull the covers over your head. And it is a reason to watch those politicians and make sure that even as they talk about legitimate points of concern, that they're not simply manipulating you for their own ends, because that truly is tragic, and they will use fear to paralyze you and simply reward themselves with another term in office.
Another question. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name's Evan Preston.
Hi.
Mr. Williams, thank you for speaking. And in beginning the discussion about the society and fear, I'd like to return for a moment to your comments that which you received, were fired for by NPR. In making your statement about Muslim Americans on airplanes, beyond simply being candid and honest about the way you felt in those moments, were you attempting to provoke a discussion about how we act on our emotions and how our own views of other people are formed? And were you making those comments with a mind toward provoking that kind of critical inquiry?
Evan, no, I wasn't. It's one of these things where I'm not out of this storm yet, so I don't have a lot of perspective on what just happened to me. But people say to me, excuse me, people say to me, hey, Juan, do you wish you'd said that differently? Sort of in the shower the next day or two, and now that you know what has happened, do you ever think, gosh, I wish I hadn't done that or hadn't said that, or it's not what I meant? And in fact, that's exactly what I meant. And that's the true feeling I have of anxiety in that situation. Now, what's very clear to me is that I then went on to say, I wasn't saying it to provoke Bill O'Reilly or to be simply provocative to the audience. I was using it as a point of departure to say, yeah, I understand because I personally have experienced this kind of fear, but I know that you can't then leap to make judgments about people based on that feeling. That we don't leap to make judgments based about Christians on Timothy McVeigh, and we shouldn't do it in terms of the people who have perpetrated the violence of terrorist activity against us who are Muslim. And I went on to say, and I think it's all there on the record, on the transcript. You can look at it, you can watch it or read it, to say very clearly that, the idea of someone attacking a cab driver in New York or threatening to burn the Koran or saying you can't build your mosque or your synagogue or your church where it's proper. We have to be careful about these things and make sure that we don't violate our Constitution, our constitutional protections for people of all faiths. I said these things. So I was building an argument and engaging with Bill O'Reilly, who had made a legitimate point. The people who did attack us on 9/11 were Muslims. And there are people out there, including this fellow who was involved with the failed Times Square attack, who says, that we haven't yet seen the blood that will come from the Islamic war against America. So I'm not trying to close my eyes to this, and I wasn't trying to stir anybody up. I was just saying, okay, so we know these things, but at the same time, we have to protect who we are and our principles and our constitutional rights as Americans, which includes religious tolerance, and not necessarily writing everybody off who's a Muslim as a terrorist. That's what I was saying. So to my mind, I didn't say anything that was so controversial or outrageous. It's one of those things where I just think I said exactly what I meant to say, and some people have taken it and twisted it, and obviously my employer thought that I was a bigot, and later that I needed psychiatric care. I'm amazed, and I'm a little stunned. I mean, I'm literally, like a guy who just got hit twice in the ring, and I just have to get my senses back about me because it doesn't make sense to me.
Thank you.
Folks, we're running through our time, so let's take one more question, and then we'll move on to other activities. Way in the back.
Hi, Mr. Williams. My name is Lionel Hong. It's nice to have finally met you.
Nice to meet you.
My question is, they're centered around leadership. And my first one is, what is leadership? And my second question is, as we know, one quarter of the American population, it's a younger population, under 18. In 10 years, in 20 years, we're going to be 28, 38. And as they step into the leadership positions, what set of skills do their leadership require that's different from the previous ones we've had in the history? And my last question is...
hey, you got to hold on. I'm 56. I can only handle so much.
Sorry.
So we'll do it one at a time, and you can follow up. But the first question was about leadership. And Lionel, I would say that right now, the model that we have had for leadership, especially over the course of the last few years, has been so heavily oriented towards people, let's say the best graduates of Gettysburg, going into financial industry, Wall Street. And I think those values have been proven to be disappointing and to be short-sighted for the most part, the chasing of dollars like that it does not provide for the greater benefit of the American people, and it has served to erode not only our economy, the big bubble, the housing bubble that burst, but it's meant that people no longer have faith in their leadership. The leadership, you think this, if the best and the brightest are going to Wall Street, well, look what they've just done. A bunch of thieves, greedy people. In the numbers that came out from the exit polls in last week's election, the number one target of the American people's anger was not the government, it was Wall Street. It was big business. And I think that kind of leadership is just a problem right now, and I think it speaks to our values and to what's really important in life. And so I think that for your generation, right now the question would be, what do you see as important? Is it simply that you want secure lives in which you have lots of money? Is that what the ideal is? A good time, a beautiful wife, a big house, lots of money. I think for lots of people now, they're trying to recalibrate, and they're thinking, what I really value, what's really going to mean something to me in a few years is if I'm able to contribute in such a way to offer leadership that inspires others, that touches others, that helps to correct some of the inequities in life. Then I truly will be someone who could be remembered and honored. If you think about the Blavatt family here tonight and what they have done in terms of creating this lecture series, or their contributions, given that their sons went to school here, their continuing contributions to build this college, I think people will honor that in a way that they may never honor whatever is in their bank account. And that changes, again, your perception of what's important in life and what's leadership. The second thing I would say to you is that there's such an issue about trust. And again, we come back to this from the family level to the government level. Let's skip business and skip culture for a moment. And there's huge problems with the culture, which is, you know, in the minds of most people, pornographic and sexually excessive, and business that we've talked about. But you come to this idea that young people today have an opportunity to speak to each other about real solutions. Now, solutions on so many central issues, like how do we educate young people, especially poor kids, and especially immigrants and minority poor kids in American life. When I was talking to you about that group of people who are under the age of 18, they're disproportionately minorities and immigrants. That's who's having babies in America today. And they're disproportionately poor. Well, so what kind of society are we building if those people never have the opportunity to get an education, to attend Gettysburg, to get their foot on the lowest rung of the ladder of upward mobility? Then suddenly they're not invested in the American dream. People who are getting education, a fine liberal arts education such as the one offered here, the ones that I think have the highest aspirations are ones who are thinking about, well, what can we do about education, especially in the big cities today, to help out those who would not become part of the American experience. They're thinking about what do we do in terms of dealing with, let's say, issues ranging from the environment to issues such as military conflict and the growing threat of terrorism around the world. How do we deal with this successfully without building walls, without becoming intolerant? These are key issues that real leaders have to address. It's not just about winning the next term in office and, you know, saying that you've been in office forever like Strom Thurmond. I mean, I don't think people honor that idea so much anymore. What's really honored as leadership are people who get in it for the right reasons and understand they will be rewarded. There is a thirst for leadership, a thirst for ideas, a thirst for solutions in American life. And if we're oriented in that direction, then we really are making a contribution that goes beyond us. And that's what I think leadership today is called to do. The people who are locked into this political argument and to this polarization and to the finger pointing and to blaming the immigrants or blaming the open, I mean, it's just tiresome. Unfortunately, that's where the political discourse is at the moment. Well, we've got to get beyond it. And I think that's to me, the clear call for your generation. Now, you had a second question.
Well, my last question is, studies have shown that in 20 years, 2030, China's GDP measured by purchasing power will be the same of America's today. And right now in America, 1 out of every 3 person has a car. And that means by 2030, the living standards of Chinese citizens raise to a level where there are going to be 400 million cars.
Right.
And right now there's only 100 million cars. And facing these economic growth trends, and also at the same time, the new generation of leadership coming into office in China, what are the risks that China is facing nowadays?
Wow, you know, this is an immense question, but the risk for China is this. The Chinese leadership is making a tremendous effort to bring its rural population into cities and to do it in such a way as that they would not come in and destabilize those cities, but in fact contribute to the economic growth. So they would have to have jobs. So they're trying to expand their economy rapidly, but and do it in a stable fashion, that it doesn't get out of hand. And they have got to turn the corner from cheap labor, which is, sort of being the world's factory, to a point where they can offer people jobs that are safe and that provide a middle-class income on which people can support a family. And this transition is truly worthy of great study, and it's requiring tremendous leadership, and it's a challenge to the American view of government, because the Chinese people are trusting their government and willing to give them powers that we in America would never give our government, censorship and control of military decisions and the like. But the Chinese people think if the government is truly helping us to become more economically stable, to grow at the same time, we'll trust you with the political stuff. Just keep the economy under control. But the challenge for Chinese leaders, given that control, is not to abuse the trust, first of all, and secondly, is to understand that their changes are going to have an amazing impact on the world. They are changing the global economy. And that if you simply ignore things like terrorism or like the abuses that have been taking places in resource-rich lands like Africa, South America, and you say, I have nothing to do with it, I'm not interested in that foreign policy, I'm not interested in that conflict, I'm not interested in what happened in Darfur, that then the rest of the world does not see China as a responsible world citizen. They see them as selfish, self-interested, and even threatening. That when China does not speak in such a way that it would help to curtail North Korea's nuclear ambitions, that the rest of the world then says, well, you're not even controlling your own neighborhood. And then there becomes a point of potential conflict between, let's say, the US and China, that could easily then grow into a huge international war. These are points of danger, especially since the Chinese people are putting such trust in their leadership right now in exchange for the promise of economic growth. So for the Chinese leadership right now, it's almost as if they're facing a mirror image of the American problem. It's not an absence of trust in leadership. It's an abundance of trust, and the question about whether or not China will live up to its true potential as a world leader and be responsible to its citizens and to the idea of its leadership role as a citizen of the world. Thanks for asking the question, Lon.
Thank you.